Welcome, welcome. How's everyone doing? Good. Happy Friday, everybody. Yeah, lots of thumbs up there. And we have beautiful weather too, which is, at least here in Alabama, which is fantastic. Okay, so looks like we've got at least 26 people. We may get some more trickling in. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, awesome. And I see a couple faces from yesterday, which is great. I think we have some new people joining us today too. I'm not going to give too much of a review, but just quickly, I want to go ahead and just remind people, I know some of you saw this yesterday, but this rain garden training is part of our larger Alabama Watershed Stewards program that we head up here at Auburn University. And we have our project partners to thank for that. That program is funded by ADEM and the EPA through a 319 grant. And our Watershed Stewards program is all about outreach and education to improve watershed health and management in the state of Alabama. And part of that is on the ground workshops like, like installing rain gardens. And I should mention, originally we were hoping to actually install a rain garden tomorrow as part of this workshop. That unfortunately got a little delayed, but we are still going to do a on the ground installation in Opelika, Alabama. And I'll give you guys an opportunity to make sure you're registered to hear more about that if that's something that you'd like to participate in the future. So anyway, that's just so you know, this is part of Alabama Watershed Stewards, and there will be more similar trainings and more opportunities to learn more if that's something that you're interested in. And I introduced myself and my team members yesterday, but for those of you who don't know, I'm Laura Bell, and I work with the Alabama Cooperative Extension Water Program here at Auburn University. I'm also joined by my colleagues, Caitlin Sweeney and our student assistant, Naomi Pitts. So they're here to help answer some questions too as we go along. But our water program here at Auburn is, we do a variety of things from, watershed education and outreach to working on grants like this one to on the ground best management practices, including rain gardens and stream restoration. So we have a lot going on, and hopefully if you have any questions about what we do, we're happy to talk about that too. So again, I saw some of you guys yesterday. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please feel free to do so in the chat. I know we're kind of limited on time, so I am going to ask that we maybe don't introduce ourselves via or audio through audio, but if you want to do that over the chat, that'd be great. It's always nice to kind of see who else is here and where you're from. And I know yesterday we had some people from all the way from Pennsylvania and South Carolina, which is awesome. And I love to see that. So definitely please feel free to do that. Okay, so a reminder, this is a 2-day workshop, and we did have the first part of this yesterday. If you missed it, not a problem. We did record it, and after the end of this session today, I'll send out a folder that you can access with both recordings and other resources. So no problem. So today, yesterday we talked about why install a rain garden. We talked about what rain gardens are, the importance of helping mitigate that stormwater flow and help capture and filter out pollutants, and the kind of impetus behind installing rain gardens. We talked about how to go out to a site and evaluate where might be a good spot for installing a rain garden. We also talked about soil assessment. Today, we're going to dig into the nitty-gritty of actually installing the rain garden and calculating the size, depth, coming up with a planting plan and maintenance. So, again, we welcome questions, but just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to leave some time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to just drop those questions in the chat, and Caitlin and Naomi will try to help us as we go along to make sure that we get everyone's questions answered. Again, you'll receive a recording if you want to rewatch this, and we'll also send out some resources that you can, review at your own leisure. Okay, so this is just a quick review for those of you who weren't here yesterday. So we talked about rain gardens. as being different from your typical garden or just, you know, typical kind of aesthetic landscape feature in the sense that they're really all about helping capture and mitigate stormwater runoff, especially in urban areas. And they are a really both aesthetic and helpful way to kind of help filter out pollutants that otherwise might get washed into storm drains and into our creeks and streams. So this is just an example here of your kind of typical rain garden. It's consisting of that kind of low depression in the landscape that has native plants, mulch, potentially amended soils, but not too complicated and definitely something that you can do. We'll go over this again too, but just as a reminder, rain gardens are designed to help kind of, like I said, filter that or help capture that stormwater runoff. So they're designed to kind of hold some of that stormwater in this ponding area before it runs off to wherever it's going, whether that be the local storm drain or somewhere else. We will talk today about how to figure that out, and we'll be going over quite a lot. Okay, let's see. We went over this a little bit yesterday too, but the benefits of establishing a rain garden, not only are you helping to make a difference in improving stormwater and cleaning your local streams, but this is also something that you can do. It can be fairly low cost. And there's also the added benefit of using native plants to increase that habitat. And like I said, it doesn't have to be too costly, and there's ways that you can make this a really attractive landscape feature for your yard. Okay, so this is kind of where we left off yesterday. Like I said, we'd already gone through the site analysis, and we have at this point selected where we want to install our rain garden. We've already called 811 and made sure that there's no utilities. We've addressed all our constraints. So we have a location that we think is going to be workable. So I know these first couple slides are review, but so we talked about, paying attention to the topography of the landscape. Where does that rainwater move when it falls onto those impervious surfaces? So I showed you guys here yesterday, this was a site that we were going to install a rain garden at, and I had gone ahead and outlined this portion of the rooftop, which we knew was going to be collecting stormwater and directing it to our potential rain garden site. And, we talked about impervious surfaces, including rooftops, those driveways, sidewalks, anywhere that stormwater is going to flow. It's not going to be able to infiltrate into the ground. Anywhere that stormwater is falling from and it may be redirected to your rain garden site, that's what we want to kind of start to calculate and keep in mind, because the size of our rain garden is going to depend upon that amount of impervious surface from which we're collecting that stormwater. Okay, so again, I know it's a review, but again, if you are trying to kind of estimate the square footage, the area of those impervious surfaces, Google Earth is a really easy way to do that. Again, you can draw out, basically you can find your site pretty easily online, and then you can just physically draw out through Google Earth the outline of that shape that is going to be redirecting stormwater to your site, and it will automatically calculate the square footage for you. Really helpful, especially if you're doing a large building or something like that. But you can also pace it out on the ground, estimate your own foot pace, and just take steps along the side of the building and count it out that way. And again, always go visit your site. I highly suggest you do that, even though you can use these online tools to help map it out. And again, this is going to be in the resources that we give you at the end of the workshop, but it's helpful to just tally all those square footage areas up so that you have an idea of what your total impervious drainage area is going to be. And that's what we really need to help calculate the size of our rain garden and the depth of our rain garden. Okay. So I think all of that is pretty clear. I know that was a little bit of a review. but hopefully everybody's on board now with the difference between, a rain garden and your standard kind of aesthetic garden, why we are interested in calculating the size of a rain garden in relation to how much stormwater runoff we're going to be getting. And, today we'll also talk about plant selection and how important that is as well in treating that stormwater runoff. All right, so we talked about this yesterday, but here's just a refresher. Sometimes it helps to see this in a different way. So components of a rain garden that we're going to be talking about today. So there's that slope, kind of where that water, the storm water is kind of coming in from. It kind of pitches a little downward. You don't want to add a really steep grade. We suggest like a 3 to 1 grade to prevent that erosion, especially if you're having a lot of stormwater runoff coming into your rain garden. There's also the inlet. That's where that stormwater is going to be entering the garden itself. And you could have one or you can have multiple. We'll talk about it more and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. There's also a little buffer edge, before you reach all your native plants. And sometimes that might just be a grassy area or a little bit of, some people even use rocks. So we'll talk about that too. And then mulch, a layer of mulch after you've done your initial planting, that's part of a rain garden as well. It helps kind of keep those new plants, moist, and it can help kind of suppress weeds, especially as those new plants are getting developed. And then we talked about ponding. That's that kind of stormwater storage area where we want our stormwater to, kind of sit for a little while, infiltrate back into the ground, and just kind of, replicate that natural hydrology that we talked about yesterday. And then the base of the rain garden, that's how we'll be estimating how deep we need to go and what that ponding depth should be. Generally, that's going to be kind of a flatter area that's going to allow our stormwater, our first flush of stormwater to kind of filter into the earth. And then we have our berm, which is a higher area towards the outfall of the rain garden. So, we have our stormwater coming in, and on the opposite side, we'd have our berm that kind of helps keep that water in place and helps it pond. And we'll talk about that as well. And then lastly, you have your overflow. That's where a kind of little divot in the berm that allows that stormwater to flow out into the landscape, basically allows it to overflow in a safe, directed way. Okay, so selecting ponding depth, that, as we talked about, is the depth at which water will pond before going through that outflow. We talked about how you can do a soil infiltration test, and you should definitely do that to make sure that your soils are going to be draining well. So, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but we suggest about 3 inches for clay soil. So if they're not draining as well, it might be wise to actually not make it as deep because you don't necessarily want it to pond for too long. We talked about how you want rain gardens to drain within a couple days. So that's one recommendation. You can also dig them down deeper though, 3 to 6 inches for those kind of well-drained soils. And again, this is all dependent upon your drainage rate when you did your infiltration test. So, if they are draining at less than 1 inch per hour, you might want to make that ponding depth a little bit more shallow. And if you have really good, well-drained soils, we might want to consider a 6-inch ponding depth. And we'll talk more about this too. A simple kind of rule of thumb is that rain gardens are often sized to be about 10%, I know my head's in the way here, of the impervious surface area draining to that rain garden. And that's just kind of something, a helpful rule of thumb to have in the back of your head. Because when we're doing these rain garden calculations, it can seem a little intimidating at first, but really they don't have to be exactly precise. I think as long as you're kind of in the ballpark and reaching that general range, that's okay. Okay, So another kind of helpful rule of thumb based off of that idea, that 10%, we're trying to aim for 10% of that impervious surface area for our rain garden size, is this 10-20 method. And this is pretty helpful and simple. So for a 3-inch ponding depth, we take our rain garden size, and we know that that equals basically impervious surface area, our square footage that we determined, and divided by 10. If we want to kind of do a 6-inch ponding depth, we would just divide that impervious area by 20. So here, here we have an example, and we're going to walk through multiple examples of this with you so that you will totally have it by the end of this workshop. But if we knew that the building that we were capturing impervious surface from was maybe 30 feet by 12 feet, then we multiply that to get that area. And then if we know that maybe our soils are not draining at a really high rate, we might want to select a 3-inch ponding depth. So to do that, we just divide that surface area by 10, and we can estimate that we'd have about a 36 square foot rain garden. Okay. And again, we'll go through this, but the 10-20 method is really kind of just helpful rule of thumb to help you estimate your rain garden size based on, that infiltration and the area that you're trying to treat. Let's see, I saw someone had a question about how critical is the size in a home garden. Is it okay for it to be larger or smaller? Yes, and I think this is kind of what Rachel asked yesterday. So again, we're trying to estimate these sizes to treat that first flush based on the amount of stormwater that we expect to get to our rain garden. But we have constraints. We can't always do that. So you can have it be larger or smaller. And if you've designed it well to have that overflow, that should be okay. It'll just simply mean you won't be able to treat necessarily all of that square footage that you would like to, but you can still do a pretty good deal of just being able to capture some of that. And we can talk more in depth about that too later on, Beth, if you want. Okay, so when we talk about ponding depth, we're also thinking about excavation depth. So when we go to install our rain garden, how deep does it need to be to get that ponding depth? And this is a little tricky too. So, okay, so if we're aiming for a 3-inch ponding depth, we actually need to dig down more than 3 inches, especially if we're going to be adding a mulch layer or if we're going to be amending some of our topsoils. So, I would suggest that you think about that. Typically we suggest at least 3 inches of mulch on top. And then you might want to dig down even a little bit more to amend some soils or put some topsoil back in. So ultimately what you should end up, if you want a 6-inch ponding depth, you might have to dig down 9 inches and then add back in that mulch to make up those 3 inches. So at the end, basically the depth between the bottom of your rain garden and that top overflow area, that should measure out to your desired ponding depth. And we can talk more about that too, but just something to keep in mind when we're going into installation. Okay, so going back to our earlier example there of the building I was telling you about that we were going to install a rain garden at. So I used Google Earth, like I said, to calculate their square footage, and we were going to be capturing a decent amount of square footage. So, but we had done an infiltration test, and we knew that the soils were pretty good in terms of drainage. So we had decided that we could opt for a 6-inch ponding depth. So to get that ratio, we took that square footage in area, divided it by 20, and we estimated that our ideal rain garden size might be about 394 square feet. So, okay, so we have that. Then how do we go to determining, well, what is the actual kind of length by width that we want our rain garden to be? So one easy way to do that is you can just take the square root. And when we did that, we get an estimate of about 20 by 20. But you don't have to stick with only those dimensions. You can rework them to kind of fit into the constraints that you have. So, you know, I told you we had pretty good drainage. We were getting about 7 inches per hour. So we did select that 6-inch ponding depth, and we were planning on digging down, of course, at least 9 inches or maybe even 10 if we had some topsoil to put back in. And then planning on adding that extra little layer of mulch. But ultimately, we would end up with a 6-inch ponding depth. Okay, so this is a little bit of a review of some stuff we've already said, but keep in mind that ponding depth needs to also, well, when you're excavating to that ponding depth, you also need to be factoring in mulch and soil amendments. We want to be aiming for, like we had in that example, a kind of flat bottom to your rain garden, but a slight center depression is okay. You know, we don't, in short, we kind of don't want to have all the water only in one very low spot. We want to kind of have it distributed. So as we're doing our excavating too, we also want to be keeping in mind that we want to stockpile some of that soil and grass that we might be removing from a site. And we're going to be saving that, keeping it aside and saving it for a berm, and hopefully reapplying some of the topsoil that we've removed. You know, that's like the first 4 inches or so. And that's typically really good, rich soil that we might want to put back into our rain gardens, because it's often some of the best soil, but it depends upon your site. So, okay, so we talked about amended soils. So again, you can do a soil test, especially after you've done your rain garden and you want to make sure that the soils are appropriate for plants. You can also do, you could do a soil test to kind of see what the composition of your soils are. If you don't have time to do that, there's also the option to add in other types of amendment, like compost. If your soils are not draining really well, some people add in sand, but I will just make a slight caveat there that do not use sandbox sand. You want to be using coarse sand if you make any sort of sand amendment, because there is a difference, and the coarse sand won't kind of clump, or actually that round sand can actually not help the soils not drain as well, but the coarse sand will help with some drainage. So there's a couple different ways you can do this, and it really depends upon the composition of your soil, but you can have a mixture there of sand, that topsoil, you know, that kind of rich topsoil, and compost, if you're putting some of that back in to help those new plants get established. And more details are going to be in the resources that we give you at the end of this workshop. So if you want to dig into that a little more in depth, there will be more details on that as well. Okay, so let's get into an example together. We'll do one together, and then we'll break out into groups and we'll do our own example as well. Okay, so this is an aerial view of a house, and we're thinking about installing a rain garden here. The kind of little red dots are symbolizing our downspouts. You know, we did our site analysis. We identified where those downspouts were. So those are our downspouts. And the areas that are highlighted are kind of the impervious surfaces that we know are going to be draining to our potential rain garden site. That's outlined there in green. Okay, so for our hypothetical situation here, we've estimated that we have about a 50 by 50 foot rooftop total, that kind of square area that's outlined. And we know that we have about 400 square feet of a driveway that will also drain to the rain garden. We've done our infiltration test. We know we have pretty good drainage. There's over 1 inch per hour. And we're going to be walking through how do we determine what size it should be. Okay, so first thing to do is we want to calculate all of those impervious surfaces that we talked about. So we'll start with the roof. You know, if we have a 50 by 50 foot roof, we'll multiply that to get the square footage, and that 2,500 is our estimated rooftop total square footage. But that's the whole roof. So what do we do if not all of the roof is draining to our particular site? There's an easy way to do that. You can estimate what percentage of that rooftop is going to be draining to the site. So just to go back, you know, I showed you this image. We kind of know this is about the area of the rooftop that's going to be draining. So that looks like about a quarter. So what we can do here is multiply our square footage by whatever percent of that rooftop we think is going to be draining to the site. So in our case here, it's about a quarter. So that gives us, you know, 625 square feet of rooftop to be treated in our rain garden. Okay, everybody with me there so far? Okay, so we got that. We also know that we have the driveway that's also going to be flowing into our rain garden, right? So we want to make sure that we add that in. So, you know, here we go. We've outlined those, that area that's going to be draining, and we know that we need to add them all together. So here we go. We just combine that, and we end up with, you know, over 1,000 square feet that our rain garden should be designed to treat. Okay, so we've come up with that. We kind of know what our impervious surface square footage and area should be. What about our ponding depth? We know that we have pretty good drainage, so we could opt for a 6-inch ponding depth. And sometimes this depends upon the size and your kind of site constraints. So, you know, if you needed to make that rain garden smaller, you could opt for a 6-inch ponding depth and hopefully treat still as much. So if you were going to opt for 3 inches, we'd use our 10-20 rule. You could divide that by 10 to get that 3-inch ponding depth, and we would come up with about 100 square foot sized rain garden. If we decide to offer that 6-inch ponding depth, we're going to divide it by 20, and you can see it's going to be smaller, but it's going to be deeper. So that could potentially help with our size site constraints if we needed it. So that would be about 50 square feet. Okay. And again, you know, when we go to install our rain garden, we want to be thinking about how deep we would actually need to be digging down, especially depending upon if we need to add in some compost or some coarse sand. We need to be factoring that into our excavation depth. All right, so we are going to try this and see how it goes, but I'm going to challenge you guys. What I'm going to do is put you all into some breakout rooms. We've got almost 30 people here, so I'm going to just break you up into kind of small groups of about 5, and I'm going to give you a worksheet. Caitlin, maybe you can help me get that link up. But we're going to give you a worksheet that you can download. And essentially, it's just going to walk you through the same steps that we just went through, except with some different dimensions. And we'll give you about 5 to 10 minutes to kind of work together in a group and come up with some rain garden sizes. And then we'll come back and we'll discuss kind of what you guys found and how that went. Let me see if we've got it here. Okay, great. So Caitlin just dropped that in the chat. So let me know if you guys are able to open that. Are most people able to download that? I'm just going to make sure that you're able to see that before I put you guys into breakout rooms. Okay, Naomi's got it open. Okay, we got a couple yeses. Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm going to put you into breakout rooms, and like I said, we'll give you 5 to 10 minutes to work on it, and I'll just bring everybody back and we'll discuss it. Let's see, Linda, if you're having issues with it, I bet you someone else in your team will have it, and they can probably help walk through those steps. Okay, and yeah, Tyler's driving. That's fine, Tyler. You'll just get to listen along. All right, here we go. And you should get an invitation to join your breakout room. Just accept that and it'll all be automatic. I've had Caitlin here double check me, so fortunately, I hope we'll all be on the same page with our calculations. Okay, so who are these numbers looking right for you guys? Is this what you all got? Okay, great. So we ended up with about 1,875 square feet to be treated. We added in that parking lot area and got to 3,075 square feet. We ended up setting our, I'm not sure what you guys ended up setting your ponding depth to, but here I've divided that by 20, and you could do that at 3 inches or 6 inches, depending upon what you wanted to go with. So at 3 inches, I ended up with about 307.5 as our total rain garden area, and at 6 inches, about 153. Okay, so everybody on board? Looking good? Okay, good. So, you know, I think I'd mentioned earlier that rain gardens don't have to be exact, right? They can be, they don't have to be as precise. So for the 3-inch ponding depth there, you know, we had 307. I rounded up, and some of you guys may have rounded down. So I kind of ended up with this possible size of about, you know, 18 by 18. But again, we can rework those sizes depending upon our site constraints. And these would be some other potential sizes or dimensions that would probably treat about the same amount. 10 by 30, 15 by 20, all kind of aiming for that about 300 square feet. And same thing with 6-inch. We went through the same process, and I came up with potentially about a 13 by 13 square foot rain garden. Did anyone get anything radically different than this? Okay, I assume not. If not, we'll discuss in your Q&As, and we can we'll double check. But in the worksheets that you're going to get, or the materials you're going to get after the workshop, we'll include this. You know, this might be just a helpful way for you to walk through calculating your own site once you get to do your own site analysis. So we'll include this, the actual worksheet and the cheat sheet, just in case you want to double check. Okay, so we talked about those different rain garden sizes that you can have. You know, all of these different sizes can treat about the same amount of stormwater runoff. And something to keep in mind is, you know, we've talked about how the purpose of a rain garden in part is to help treat that stormwater runoff. So if you have a kind of elongated shape here, like we have with this 20 by 5 shape, if you're kind of if the water is kind of flowing in there at the top, imagine that it would have a longer distance to go before it would reach the outfall. So that could be a helpful shape to kind of guide that stormwater through if you wanted to treat more. But I mean, essentially, you'll pick a shape that kind of fits with the site and hopefully kind of integrates into the landscaping that is already existing there. All right, so now that we've done all this planning, we kind of know what our rain garden size should be, the depth it should be, et cetera, let's think about what do we need to do all this? We need some tools. So these are just some of the tools that you might need. And if you don't have them all, I bet that you could borrow some. You'll need something to kind of break up the soil, you know, the shovels, backhoe, anything that's going to be helpful in loosening up those soils and helping you excavate. Some people use actual machinery, especially if they're doing a larger rain garden. That could be more difficult to come by. And again, you don't have to do that. You can do it by hand. And it's a great way to get volunteers to come out and help you do some of this work as well. Because doing it by yourself could be a challenge. But fortunately, there's always volunteer groups that you could always reach out to and see if they'd be interested in learning with you. So wheelbarrows, definitely have some of those. Stakes and string, we'll talk about why you might need that. Tarps can be helpful when you're removing that soil in the initial digging down to that ponding depth. It can be helpful to just have a tarp to put that on if you need to move it around, or you don't want to deal with trying to move it or shovel it up later. Again, you don't have to have this with you necessarily, but you can think about soil testing to make sure that you have the right amendments needed for your rain garden. And then we'll talk about this too, but having a ruler or something to help you measure that ponding depth. And then thinking ahead, spray paint potentially if you are doing a large rain garden and you have a nice rain garden plan that you really want to stick to, that could be helpful when you're working with a lot of volunteers. Okay, and I know we got some questions in the chat. I'm going to come back to that. So, okay, so we talked about the ponding depth. So what's a helpful way to do that? You know, we kind of know that our rain gardens are probably going to be on a slightly sloped area of land just because they're going to be helping kind of capture that stormwater runoff. So, but not too sloped, as we discussed yesterday. So this is why you might need those stakes. You can place an uphill stake and a downhill stake and then tie a piece of string across the two to be level. And this will help give you a reference point when knowing how far to dig down into your ponding depth. So get this kind of set up to begin with, and this will allow you to kind of know how deep to dig. So as you're digging out, let's say that you want to dig down to 9 inches. If you want to do a 6-inch ponding depth, we want to dig down 9 inches, at least to have a mulch layer. So we would remember to have that kind of inflow, not be extremely steep, but maybe like a 3-to-1 ratio. And we kind of want our rain garden base to be relatively flat, could be a little bit bold, but relatively flat if possible. And then we want to go ahead and measure that from the base to the top of the string there, which is basically where our outflow is going to be. We'll measure that and make sure that we've got about 9 inches, or depending upon your ponding depth, 6 inches. And just kind of do a variety of measurements to make sure that you're relatively consistent across the board there. While we're doing that, we'll be thinking about building the berm too, so that, you know, that soil that you're excavating, you can be putting that on a tarp and be building your berm, which, you know, we talked about is helping kind of keep that water in place. We will have that little outflow notch, but we do want to have a berm to help kind of allow for that ponding to actually occur. So the berm should be mounted as high as the uphill grade of the rain garden. So you can kind of see that in that illustration. And let's see. And we'll make sure this is accessible to you guys too, so you can of course revisit it. Sometimes it's just helpful to see that kind of diagram when you are in the process of doing this. Let's see. Let me move on here. So installation. We talked about the inlet, so that's where the stormwater is going to be flowing into your rain garden. Sometimes that can be pretty high flow depending upon where your rain garden is located. So often erosion can be a little bit of an issue right in that kind of that inlet area. So one way to deal with that is you can use a little bit of gravel or rocks, or even a concrete splash if it's coming down from a downspout, to kind of help slow down some of that storm water as it's entering the rain garden. And that can be really helpful, especially when you're trying to get your plants established in the beginning. And here's just an example there on the right of what that can look like. It can still be aesthetic while also being pragmatic. This is just another example of what that can look like. I mean, these are about one foot across, with that kind of, those rocks kind of helping break up that stormwater volume. Well, I don't want to say volume, speed perhaps. And, you know, this is an example just right off a road where they've done kind of multiple little inlets there. So depending upon what your site looks like, be thinking about that as well. Okay, so we talked about overflow. So that's that spot, that low spot or that notch that's created in the berm to help serve as that overflow. So you know, we may not be able to capture all of that stormwater runoff. We want to make sure that there is space for that water to flow out, even if we are, you know, ponding some of that water and infiltrating it slowly. We still want to make sure that there's a designed overflow. And you can stabilize that. I mean, this can also be an area where you might have some erosion or problems occur, but you can stabilize that sometimes with landscape fabric if that's something you want to do. A little bit of stones, much like the inflow. And some people plant grass along that area as well to help prevent that erosion. So you want to be thinking too about where that overflow is going to be directed. We talked about making sure that we don't make our neighbors mad by directing our overflow into their yard or anything like that. So just, you know, be cognizant and thinking about that there does need to be kind of a directed outflow for your rain garden. And here you can see in that diagram all of those different stages with the gutter downspout going into the rain garden with that mulch layer, that kind of lower ponding area, and eventually that water overflowing on the other side. Okay. So I showed you guys some examples of rain gardens yesterday. And again, this is just a reminder, these can be in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. And here's some examples of how they've used rocks here as part of their inflow, especially in that top left corner. So again, it can still be part of the kind of aesthetic of the rain garden itself. And here's just a couple more examples. I think my head's in the way, but that's another inflow coming from a road into a rain garden in our CS example, and the same thing there at the top. And that hopefully that kind of gives you an example of how rain gardens can still be a really aesthetic feature in the landscape. Let's see, Beth, and I'm going to try to get to some of your comments. Yeah, she said some of these look like they might be in the middle. The middle of the garden is higher than the surrounding lawn. That one on the top left looks like it is definitely capturing some of that storm water. The one on the right there might be a little bit of a questionable example, but it may just be hard to tell from the photo. Okay. So other thoughts that we kind of discussed a little yesterday, depending upon your site, especially if you have a very steep slope that you are considering addressing, we don't want to necessarily put a rain garden there, but there are other options, and you can reach out to a landscape architect or an engineer to help come up with some innovative solutions for your landscape. Avoid making those neighbors mad, of course. This will require some maintenance. We're going to get into that in just a second. I know we only have a half hour left, so I'm going to try to go kind of quickly. So this won't necessarily solve your standing water or poor drainage problems. Again, we don't necessarily want to place our rain gardens in areas where there's a high water table or there's a lot of standing water. In the resources that we're going to give you, there are options for wet rain gardens that simply just don't drain as fast, and you can adapt and kind of deal with that by adapting in plants that are more adapted to wetlands. So those are some options, and we'll provide you some resources if that's what your site is looking like. Again, if you're installing a rain garden in tandem with other construction activities, do it last. You don't want that sediment from a construction site washing into your rain garden and clogging it up or hurting your plants. Okay. And again, I'm going to try to get to some of these questions at the end if Naomi or Caitlin don't tackle them first. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So plants, I think this often is a little bit of an overlooked part, especially if you've done all that hard work of, you know, figuring out the ponding depth and the rain garden size. It can be a little difficult to persevere and do plants, but these are really critical parts of your rain garden, and can be also the key to making sure that your rain garden's aesthetically acceptable, depending upon what kind of neighborhood you live in. So taking the time to select your plants carefully and organize them so that they can be an attractive landscape feature, I think is pretty critical. So, okay, something to note, when we're planting in our yard, we definitely don't want to be planting invasive plants. It's hard to know sometimes what is invasive and what isn't, especially since sometimes invasive plants are even sold in big box stores. But depending upon where you are, you can look that up. There's an Alabama Invasive Plant Council, and they have a list of plants that are invasive. If you're in another state, I'm sure that you can find a similar list where you are. These are just some examples of kind of common invasive plants that we may not think about. Nandina, everybody loves that as a landscaping plant, but it's actually invasive. Chinese tallow tree, another one we tend to see. Pampas grass even is becoming invasive down here in the southeast. And of course, kudzu. So just be cognizant. English ivy is another one that we often don't think about as being really problematic, and that's sold frequently. So we don't want to be doing any ecological damage while we're also planting our rain gardens. So we want to be planting native plants. You know, these are plants that are well adapted to the region that you're in. Depending upon where you are, that may vary. So for those of us here in the Southeast, the plants that we're going to cover today are native to this region. But, you know, if you're up in Pennsylvania or you're in South Carolina, there may be other native plants that could be a better option for you. So native plants are naturally occurring. They're plants that, like I said, are adapted to live in this environment. And they promote native wildlife because wildlife has also evolved to, you know, rely on these native plants. So making sure that we bring those back into our ecosystems is really important. They are low maintenance, but they're not no maintenance. So especially in those early development stages, they may require less attention, but you still need to pay attention and make sure that they're getting enough water to get really established. Okay. So I'm going to just talk through a couple of these different planting options and different plants that you can use. Again, just be keeping in mind that when we plant native plants, we're also helping bring in pollinators, and you could have your rain garden kind of double as a pollinator garden. I already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but they are a really critical part. And the plants we pick need to be both flood and drought tolerant, which if the plants are adapted to your area, they probably will be, but we'll talk about how to select for those different needs, the different plant needs that are in those different kind of stages of your rain garden. They're really important there for that soil stabilization. And like we said, they're low maintenance, and you can often buy them through nurseries. And we're going to give you a list of nurseries that, at least here in Alabama, where it may not have been updated recently, but where there's, you could potentially get some native plants, or at least look around for native plants. So even though we're opting for native plants, you know, keep in mind that they still take a couple of years to get developed. And sometimes in the very beginning, when you're planting, you know, your rain garden might look more like this. It doesn't look as full because those plants are going to take a couple of years. So this is really a long-term vision that you have to have. And it's not just kind of plug and play and you're done. It does take time. So this is an example of, you know, these plants that were established this first year, second year growth, getting a little bit bigger. And you can see how we've had to think about how big they're going to get to make sure that we give them enough space to grow to their appropriate size. And then 2 years later, it's starting to look a lot more established, a lot more aesthetic. And we're kind of getting that aesthetic that we want. Okay, so let's cover some of these plants. There's a wide variety for you to choose from. And again, it's going to depend upon where you are. But when we are thinking about how to plant our rain garden, we want to be thinking about a couple different things. So we don't want to just plant it all the same type, because not only would that be maybe aesthetically boring, but it's also not as great for habitat. And we want to make sure that we, you know, build in a little resilience just in case some of those plants are not going to survive as well. So, you know, use different types of plants, trees. I don't often suggest using trees, especially since that root system can kind of take over your rain garden, but you can think about how trees would integrate into your kind of rain garden or your whole site in general. but you can think about different height levels of those different plants, the different texture, as they say in landscape architecture, that those would provide. And you want to think about what they're going to look like when they are mature. So do your homework, see what's available, and we'll talk through how to do some of that. This is a nursery that I particularly like. They're based in North Carolina, and they have a wide variety of native plants that you can select from for the Southeast. I'm not only advocating for them, but what I think is helpful, even if you're not going to order necessarily from them, their Mellow Marsh Farms, is that they have this really cool little tool you can use. You can select, you can kind of filter plants by category, and they have a whole rain garden category. So if you go to their website and look at their rain garden category, they've already got those native plants, you know, kind of filtered out depending upon whether or not they're adequate for rain gardens. And they have kind of detailed information about those plants too, like whether they like sun, whether they like to have wet feet, or, as they say, or whether they like to be higher up kind of in the rain garden. So that's just a helpful tool, and we'll link that as well. But just keeping in mind, there's lots of tools like this for you to kind of identify what those native plants are. Here's just a couple for you guys to be keeping in mind, especially here in the Southeast. Native plants can be really beautiful. So Stokes Aster here, you know, beautiful purple flower. Things that we want to be keeping in mind are, what are their light requirements? This one's going to need full sun to partial shade. And when it's mature, it needs to, it's going to be about, you know, 1.5 feet tall and wide. So we need to make sure that it's spacious, pretty low maintenance. And we're going to be thinking about seasonality too. It blooms there in the spring to summer and can resow. So it's a perennial. Beth said, loves Stokes Aster. Yeah, that's great. I do too. Butterfly weed is another beautiful one. I mean, look at that bright color. And of course, it's a pollinator attractor. So you get the co-benefit of that. It does well on those perimeters, so maybe not getting all that pooled water there at the very base of your rain garden, but it could be a really good perimeter plant, likes that sun. Keep in mind, it's going to get pretty big, especially when it's mature. It can be up to 3 feet wide, so it's something that we need to think about when we're planting it. It does pretty well with the drought, and of course, you get those butterflies and hummingbirds. So that's another great one. Orange coneflower is one that I love. Purple coneflower too. I have a lot of that in my yard. This one is also a really good parameter plant, and it can look really intentional, especially when you plant those coneflower plants kind of in bunches or, you know, in groups of maybe 2 or 3. They will grow and mature, and they kind of grow in clusters anyway, but they can look really nice and intentional when you put them together in those kind of groups. We'll talk about planting plants in a second. But this is really low maintenance, and they come back year after year. So there's not a whole lot of work that you have to do once they get established. And you get that beautiful yellow from, you know, summer to fall. So again, we'll think about seasonality. You want kind of different colors to be coming into bloom in your rain garden throughout the season. So you don't just kind of have a dead looking rain garden. You want to kind of plan for those different seasons. Okay, but yeah, purple coneflower. This is also a really big butterfly attractant, and it does well. It's pretty adaptable. It can do well in those parameters or more towards the center. It needs that full sun to partial shade, so it wouldn't do well in really shady areas. And it gets pretty big. So, you know, 3 feet wide, 3 feet tall as it grows to maturity. And it's blooming pinkish purple in summer from May to September, at least down here in the south. Virginia's SWEETSPIRE is another really pretty one, and it can do well towards the center. I suggest, again, you think about kind of clumping or grouping it. And it's a semi-evergreen, and it can also get pretty big. So when we're doing rain garden planning, you also want to think about kind of like levels of sight. So those plants that we're putting on our parameters, they we want them to kind of be good border plants, but we might also want them to be a little lower so that we can also see the plants that we plant in the center. So I almost think about it as terracing, think about towards the outer end, you want it to be a little bit shorter and then kind of moving up towards the center and then moving back down. That way you can kind of get a better visual of the entire rain garden. And we'll talk about that more. Inkberry holly could be a good one as well. It's more of a shrub, and depending on how large you want it to get, you might have to do a little maintenance there. But it's an evergreen, which is really nice. You're going to keep that color throughout the entire year. And it attracts honeybees, and we all like that, maybe. But it's really good for pollinators. And but it can get pretty large. So just keep that in mind, depending upon what your rain garden site and aesthetic is. Beautyberry is another kind of colorful native that we see here a lot in the South. I will say in the winter, it's not going to keep its leaves and it may not be as colorful. So you definitely want to make sure that you have something else kind of planned for the winter. But it does have these really pretty berries during the summer, and it can get pretty big. So it can be about 6 foot tall, but it does have a lot of, benefits as well. Let's see. Yeah, get that pretty lavender pink from June to August down here. So we also want to think about grasses. It's nice to have a variety of, both flowers and kind of native grass as well. So purple lovegrass is one that we like, and it can be placed it can kind of just help fill in a rain garden and maybe helpful on those parameters too, between those groupings of plants. It likes full sun. And it can be about 1.5 feet tall wide, but it can grow pretty well in sandy soils. And it has these pretty little purple frills there at the top. It can spread. It spreads underground via rhizomes. So, want to make sure it's not getting out of hand. Another one that we really like, we have a lot of these around Auburn with our low impact development designs, is muley grass. And this is just a really pretty texture of a plant. Well, it also has really great benefits for uptake of nutrients. So it's a really good plant for dealing with stormwater runoff. And it does not like wet feet necessarily. So you want to make sure that it's going to be planted not at the very center of your rain garden, but maybe around those edges. And it can get pretty large, but again, it's really aesthetic, and even though it won't be necessarily pink throughout the whole year, it'll still be an attractive landscape feature. Okay. Do the grasses do anything for pollinators? I think I'm sure it depends. I'm not sure if any of them have do any sort of flowering, or the muley grass does. I don't know. I think it depends upon the type of grass perhaps, but they do have a lot of benefits in terms of that erosion control, and they tend to have really good root systems. So that's another benefit. Okay, plant selection. And again, I'm just trying to get through this so we have time for some Q&A at the end there before 3:30. So I mentioned this earlier. We want to think about planting height. We don't want to just go in and willy-nilly have our plants thrown about in our rain garden. So when you're kind of looking these plants up, be thinking too about those different height levels and where they like to be in terms of whether they can deal with standing water or not. So it's helpful to just sometimes even draw it out for yourself, and just make sure that you kind of have a variety of different heights in your rain garden. I also talked about the seasonal interest. Some of this might be a little hard to read, but this is helpful to be keeping in mind too, just to make sure that something is always visually attractive in your rain garden at any time of the year, especially in the winter. We find that winterberry can be a really pretty addition. Those bright red little seeds, and birds also really like that. So keep that in mind as well. I'm sure you'll have lots of plants blooming from summer to fall and spring, but making sure that you have a good variety built in can be really helpful. Flower color is another thing. I like to have a variety built in, but again, I suggest you think about clumping those plants or clumping those colors together so that it looks more intentional. One of the things that we struggle with here when we're trying to install low impact development projects, whether it's bioretention or rain gardens, is that there's often pushback against the messy aesthetic that people often associate with anything natural. And in urban areas, that can be a little bit of a tough sell. So if we do a good job with thinking about how we can make it look intentional, that can really go a long way in getting people on board with the rain garden design. So we mentioned this too, fruit color. It's not just flowers. We're also thinking about fruit color. That can be something to add a little visual interest to your rain garden. So we have a couple examples of this in the resources we're going to share, but this is a helpful way to, when you're planning it out for yourself, to do it. You can have your plant's name there on the left, and then just kind of scribble in generally when you think when it will bloom or be providing some color. And that'll just, make sure that something is going to be visually attractive. Oh, Christine, thank you for saying that. Winterberry can be poisonous to household pets. I was not aware of that. Something to keep in mind for residential gardens. Okay, good to know. Yes, and Beth, if you make your scribble on the color of the flowers, I agree, that would definitely help. Okay, plant spacing. We want to think about that, the size of the plant when they get to maturity. So keep that in mind too. Read that plant label for spacing in advance. To kind of rule of thumb is you want to give about 2 feet, 1 to 2 feet spacing for perennials, 2 to 3 feet for grasses, maybe 3 to 5 feet for shrubs, and 6 to 8 for those large shrubs. So when we're planning our planting out, that's definitely something to be thinking about. This is a little equation that could be helpful just in kind of getting the gist of how many plants you might need for your rain garden area. So if you're estimating, I find it just helpful as an estimate. If you know what your rain garden area is in your square feet there, and you know that you're probably going to be planting perennials, which are going to need 2 feet in terms of 2 feet spacing in between each other, so about 4 square feet. You can do this kind of division here, which will help give you an estimate of how many plants you might want to order or purchase for your rain garden. But again, depending upon what you order or what you want your design to be, you can also draw it out, map it out, and just be prepared. This is an example of a standard rain garden design, and this will be in your resources too. But here on the left, you can see how they have organized it based on kind of color and the number of plants. So that's, the color, I think that they expect those plants to provide and how many of them should be planted there. And that's a really kind of simple way to do that. And then there on the top, you can see how we've drawn it out. So you have a better idea of where those plants actually will be spaced and what it's going to look like a little more. And again, this could provide some inspiration to you depending upon what your rain garden, what you want it to look like. But that's for about an 8-foot by 12-foot rain garden design. So, there's lots of different ways you can do this. Personally, I like a asymmetrical design, so it looks a little more natural. This is an example that we'll also provide. It's in our low impact development for State of Alabama book. And I'll give you a link for that so you can actually see these a little more in depth. So, you can tell here how they've made use of that clumping technique. We have kind of, even though it's asymmetrical, it still looks intentional because they're kind of putting those plants together so you have like pops of different color at different heights. And it can come across as looking not overly planned, but intentional. You can also do symmetrical designs if you're into the symmetry. Same sort of thing. This is designed to be seen at different heights. So those lower plants are on the outside, moving towards height at the center and then back down. And you can draw this out yourself. I think that's always been a helpful way to do it. We'll also give you this rain garden list, even though it doesn't have pictures associated with it. It can be helpful, especially for those of you who are worried about shade. This kind of gives you an outline of which plants need what, and you can do a little more research and look up what they look like. That's also in our low impact development handbook. All right, maintenance. The fun part that everybody's worried about. Maintenance is something that's part of a rain garden, caring for a rain garden, but with those native plants, hopefully it won't be too much. So one of the things we need to be worried about with maintenance is, especially in the very beginning when you're doing your rain garden, we want to be thinking about when we plant. We don't really, ideally, we don't want to be planting in the middle of summer because it's going to be really hard for those new plants to deal with all the heat and the drought. So it's best to plant in the early spring or fall. Again, depending upon where you are. We have pretty mild falls down here. So those roots can take a couple years to get established. So we do want to make sure that we irrigate after planting, even though this is a rain garden and it'll catch some of that stormwater runoff. You know, take a little more care in the beginning and make sure that your plants are getting well rooted. It's good to plant in that dormant season. So if you plant before kind of quote unquote the plant wakes up for spring, getting it in the ground then can be really wise so it's ready to grow and root when it becomes warm. So this is just an example of a maintenance schedule that can give you a rule of thumb. Ideally, if your rain garden is located in a kind of visual area, you'll be watching it, paying attention, but you would be watching for that soil erosion, especially if it's coming off of parking lots or you're getting a lot of stormwater flow to your rain garden. Be watching for that. If you're getting trash coming in from maybe a street or a driveway or something like that, keep an eye on that as well. You'll need to eventually put more mulch on there. Just it kind of depends upon when you'll need to do that, but ideally you want to have about 3 inches of mulch to help keep down those weeds and keep the soil moisture in. Plant replacement, sometimes you lose plants, especially if they don't get established. So something to keep an eye on, especially if certain plants are not doing well, you might want to opt for different types. And then another thing that we've noticed, especially when installing rain gardens, if you're thinking about this in like a school or maybe your work area, is communicating to maintenance crews that your rain garden is not not just weeds. So sometimes it can be helpful to make sure there's some sort of visual perimeter. Sometimes you can use rocks or a sign or who knows, something to kind of visually indicate to people to not mow down your rain garden, especially when it's new. So something to keep in mind there. Okay. Let's see. And I'll try to get to these chat questions too. So I've mentioned the Low Impact Development Handbook. That's another resource that we have here in Alabama. And we've developed a rain garden manual and kind of adapted some of that from this Low Impact Development Manual. But if you're interested in general in more specifics about low impact development, it's a really handy book for digging in deeper. It's also got detailed maintenance guides, plant lists, other types of low impact development. So we'll provide a PDF to that, but you can also find that on ADEM's website permanently. So you can go Google it, look for it there if you lose your PDF. And Beth, this booklet also has recommendations for wet rain gardens and wetlands. So if you want details about wetlands, that would be where I would go. Okay, just in time. Great, we've done it right in the nick of time. So I'm gonna stop here and open this up for questions. And yeah, I'd love to hear. Oh, well, actually, before I do that, Caitlin, do you mind helping me drop that link to our survey, feedback survey in the chat box here? I do have a quick survey for you guys, just to help get some feedback on what you guys thought about this workshop and what you'd like to see in the future or what you'd like improved. It's the first time we've done this online, so we're still learning, and I would definitely love to get that feedback. So we are going to get a link dropped there in the chat in just a second. In the meantime, though, what questions did you guys have? Let me see. Somebody was asking about mulch removal. Okay. I would typically probably not remove mulch. Sometimes if it's breaking, if you have too much kind of wood in the organic material, it can kind of actually remove some nutrients as that kind of decomposition process is happening. Let's see, that probably wasn't the slide, but I wouldn't typically suggest removing it, but you might want to add a new mulch layer, especially as your mulch kind of starts to decompose. Okay, great. And Caitlin just dropped that survey there in the chat box, so I would love it if you guys were able to give us some feedback on this workshop. And you guys feel free to unmute yourselves too at this point if you want to just ask questions directly or just share other resources that you've discovered. Let's see. Beth had asked about, can you use herbs in rain gardens? So you could, in terms of whether or not you're going to eat those herbs, I would be a little more hesitant about that because, again, rain gardens are designed to help kind of capture some of those pollutants. So I probably wouldn't want to put anything like cilantro or anything that's going to be low to the ground in the rain garden, particularly. But you might be able to plant those as an aesthetic. I'm not familiar with all their requirements, so I'm not sure. But be careful about eating anything that you would plant in a rain garden.
We had one question about if they can get a PDF.
Yeah, so Sherry mentioned that monarchs lay their eggs in milkweed and the caterpillars will eat the milkweed, but they'll come back. Yeah, so you can do a lot of helpful things by planting these native plants. Any other questions or thoughts?
Someone asked if they could get a PDF of the slides so they could have those equations.
Let's see. So Beth says, for a backyard rain garden, still an issue with pollution. And that would apply to a vegetable garden there too. It just depends upon your location. You know how in some of these examples, Beth, we showed water being captured from a street. So that would, probably not be a good spot to have a vegetable garden. But if it's in your backyard and it's just kind of capturing rainwater runoff, you could have vegetables in your typical garden area. I guess I'm having trouble imagining that scenario, but just be keeping in mind any sort of like highly polluted area you don't want to be planting your vegetable gardens in. Okay, someone asked about PDF of the slides and for the equations. I'm going to provide you with those worksheets, and we're going to provide you with our rain garden manual, which basically has everything that we covered today. So you'll have all that too. Okay. Any questions? And thank you guys for chiming in there in the chat as we went along. I see some good comments from Christine. So, and if anyone here who is familiar with rain gardens or does this as part of their job, if you guys have other resources that you think would be helpful for us to share, I would love to hear about that too. And we can feel free to drop that in the chat or to email me and we can distribute it to the whole list. Okay, well, that's all I have. I'm going to be following up soon with the email to all of you with those resources, and hopefully we'll end up seeing you in some future workshops. And I appreciate you all for being here. Hope everyone has a great weekend.